In a world overrun with corruption and drugs, a reformer rises to power. Hounded by the public, questioned by the media, hemmed in by unions, Brian Cookson is hostage to fortune. For real? No, he really said that. But Brian, the problem with not being a hostage to fortune is that people who don't like your proposed world tour changes are the only ones out there framing the discussion around it right now. That doesn't make you look good. Surely you've discussed this with your newly hired head of marketing, or at least I'm assuming they're newly hired because you've closed the job opening on the internet. But once again, Brian, I will do this person's job for you, at least based on the currently circulating conjecture. Also, for an organization that tends so heavily towards hiring people with legal experience, you guys seem to suck at writing non-disclosure agreements. Anyway, the big picture here is that the UCI wants to make cycling more comprehensible and more marketable. A big step in this direction is to make sure that there's only one World Tour level event going on at a given time. This would also include shortening the Vuelta, though the UCI doesn't really have the power to do that, although it's a good way for the Grand Tours to test the two-week waters. In line with this new schedule, the UCI is also trying to trim World Tour team rosters down to 22. Fewer race days require fewer riders. But I think it's also theoretically intended to limit the payroll burden on sponsors, and most importantly, to force teams to race their top names more often. I mean, none of this sounds awful so far. The UCI has also proposed reducing the number of World Tour teams to 16, which I think also sounds pretty cool, as it would let pro-continental squads sort of race their way into bigger events if they're having a good season. Except that the UCI has created a B-level World Tour tier which will take up the wildcard spots at World Tour events. I really don't get this, especially considering that the UCI is also requiring World Tour teams to have a development squad. I like development programs because they allow young riders to get better without the pressure of results and World Tour points. But if the young talents are spoken for and the doors to the biggest events are all closed, where's the incentive to sponsor a lower tier team? Sure, it works in, say, Belgium, where Wanty Group Gobert can probably still realize ROI without being a Tour of Flanders, but internationally, I don't think it holds up. I mean, what's in it for a team like CCC Polsat if they can't race at their own national tour? A lot of people have also taken issue with the UCI for not mandating that World Tour teams sponsor a women's squad. I don't really like that solution. Yes, women's cycling is pretty dysfunctional right now, but as anyone who saw the mob scenes on roadsides at the Women's Tour of Britain should know, there's huge opportunity for next to no upfront investment in the women's side. But if women's cycling becomes a welfare state of the top tier men, that low investment, high return appeal vanishes. The women's team becomes a line item in a €30 million budget. When the difference between one set of eyeballs and 100,000 is a rounding error on the ledger as a whole, there's no incentive to push the women towards marketability and thus no reasonable expectation that the current product will improve. Speaking of the current product, Rosela Rato of Estado de Mexico took the women's Giro dell'Emilia to a bevy of naked headlines and empty results reporting. What you probably know if you've been watching this podcast is that the victory is actually the capstone to a tremendously successful season that included a stint in the leader's jersey at the aforementioned Tour of Britain. It's all the more impressive considering her rather lackluster team support, which has included, on occasion, not getting paid. Fortunately, Rato has already been linked to a new Italian squad for next year. Not too many details yet, but you can keep up on this and all the other women's transfer rumors over at Podium Cafe. The men's Giro dell'Emilia was won by CCC Polsat's Davide Rebellin, who is amazingly still racing bikes and even more amazingly looking for a World Tour ride for next season. The 43-year-old has improbably age group competition in this job search from 42-year-old Chris Horner of Lampre. Maybe, though I'm not especially hopeful, the UCI will finally drop the ban hammer on Astana's current management after the third positive in, the past 15 minutes. This would open the door for the two nearly geriatric riders to get together and bring on AARP as a title sponsor. I mean, if today's Apple presentation was any indicator, the demographics are increasingly in line, especially in America. And since this doping-prompted last-second swoop was how Astana came into the sport way back in 2006, I can only imagine it would be a fitting exit as well. Tour de France course rumors. I don't care. The TDF presentation is apparently being live-streamed on Wednesday, just at 3:30 a.m. my time, though that should work out pretty well for any of you in Australia. Finally this week, Lance Armstrong returned to the headlines, so I can only imagine someone has a new book to sell. Yep, next up in milking that dead horse is Thor Hushovd, recently retired former world champion. The Norwegian recounts Armstrong saying, quote, "they all doped," in a conversation back from 2011, which is a strange tense to use because according to USADA, Lance was doping then, too. Husov justified not telling anyone about it till now because it, quote, wasn't his job, and then added, "Why doesn't the anti-doping government catch those who cheat?" Which is really a lot like,
Bear patrol tax $5. What? This is an outrage! Let the bears pay the bear tax. I pay the homer tax.
Maybe it's a side effect of being from a country so rich that they literally have $1 million in the bank for every single citizen, but it also may be indicative that it's time to start incentivizing people to rat dopers out rather than just punishing the offenders. I'm Cosmo Catalano, and that was The Week in Bike.